Greetings and welcome back to Archaeo-Soup Towers at a most auspicious time of the year. Halloween approaches, and as the nights draw in, as the space between the living and the dead grows thin, it is traditional to have old friends over for supper. Now, in all seriousness, archaeologists of all stripes are accustomed to dealing with human remains, and we have discussed this topic previously on this YouTube channel. The ethical concerns, the legal constraints, and the careful way in which we approach handling the dead. But this time of year brings skeletons into so many people's houses, you see. It becomes almost, dare I say, normal to have a skelly round to watch the telly. And it's interesting to me that that is seen as scary. I remember a conversation I had with Mrs. Soup, some pillow talk a few years ago, where I turned to her and said, you know that sensation you get when you're holding a human skull in your hand? And she was reading a book. She closed her book, turned to me, sort of leant on her elbow, looked deep into my eyes and went, no. No, I really don't know what it's like to hold a human skull in my hands. And therefore I think sometimes archaeologists can be somewhat desensitized to the reality of handling human remains, and just how strange and outside the realm of Halloween, how unusual that actually is. Sometimes I point this out to children, for example, in primary school classes. We'll be talking about prehistory, and I'll ask them what they would feel if I took them to a graveyard at midnight on All Hallows Eve, and perhaps there was a shadow or a mist in the corner, and maybe out of nowhere a door creaked, and maybe an owl called out in the distance. Now, normally these workshops take place in the relative safety of full daylight during school hours, and so we'll have a brazen boy or a brave young girl stand up and say, that's fine by me, I don't care, take me to the graveyard, I'm not scared of anything, they'll exclaim. But after a little bit of reflection and consideration, they come around to accepting that actually they would be quite scared if I just materialized them in a graveyard in the middle of the night with mist and owls and bells chiming, and the risk of bumping into perhaps a skeleton. And the reason I point this out to them at any time of the year, not just around Halloween, is to highlight that actually bumping into a skeleton for us is quite scary. It's a festive bit of frightening frippery that we have at Halloween, but for the rest of the year it's something which is genuinely not really welcome in our day-to-day lives. We hand the dead over to a funeral director when they die. The cemetery is a carefully managed space. The funeral or the cremation is a very focused and important moment for the family to say goodbye to the recently deceased. But after that, save for a few intense visits to the grave, eventually the dead are forgotten. All we need to do is look at graveyards from 60, 70, 80, 100 years ago in this country, and we can see that they fall into disrepair. Unfortunately, this is a genuine shame. And this is where actually this reflection for those young people, and hopefully for us today, becomes a moment of intrigue, because that hasn't always been the case. You see, in prehistory, just when people were starting to farm in Britain, we had monuments like long barrows being created in the landscape. West Kennet is an excellent example, where it's clear that when people died, they were carefully disarticulated and sorted into bits. The different types of bones were put into different places in the long barrow, and this long barrow was visited and revisited over and over again. It seems that actually not only were people depositing remains, but also it's likely that remains were coming out of those places and going back into people's homes. And at this point, obviously, the children really relished the opportunity to think about maybe having a skull at the dinner table or a leg bone by the fire, this kind of thing. But in all seriousness, it may well have been that people knew precisely whose remains they had back in their community, or maybe they didn't. Maybe what had happened was that the skeletons had become part of the honoured dead, the ancestors, who are nonetheless part of the living community. It's clear that people would gather and feast outside these long barrow monuments, and some more recent research has shown that actually maybe it was some people's jobs to help the bodies come apart, as it were. Maybe someone had some particularly stubborn ligaments holding their skeleton together, and you just have to give it a bit of help, maybe pulling it apart or whatever, in order to aid this sorting process, this transition between the living and the dead. But this constant interaction, seemingly for hundreds of years unbroken, is something it's quite hard for us to relate to in the modern world, because of the way that we do compartmentalize the dead. And I think sometimes archaeologists, myself included, we are guilty of being familiar with the dead, but not really bringing people along for the ride, as it were, with us in a way which isn't, I suppose, for effect. Hence the irony of this particular video. And so I've wanted for a few years now to really acknowledge that yes, I use the trappings of the dead during Halloween, and I interact with the dead at different times of the year as well. But that doesn't mean that I take them for granted, and I would invite you to consider doing the same. Consider your relationship to the dead, and their relationship to you. And so once more Halloween approaches. The veil between the living and the dead is at its thinnest. But this is an opportunity to reflect and remember that barrier has not always been so well defined. We used to live with the dead. And so I wonder, what would it be like to invite an old friend round for supper?